News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline. My guest this evening is Dr. Irvin Studin, who is the president of the 21st Century Question. He's also got a great history of involvement in education, and he's also helping the Bandanaka Center, where he gave an important speech. Very good evening to you, Dr. Studin, and welcome to Newsline.
Thanks for having me, Faraz.
And you, I have it on good record that you are Seema Studin's favorite son.
That's what she tells me.
You have no reason to disbelieve that, do you?
I have many practical reasons to disbelieve it, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much. We much appreciate your presence here with us. Obviously, Dr. Studin, the global pandemic also played its role here in Sri Lanka, and lots of student population were grossly affected. And I thought I'd ask you at the start is, what was the global impact on education?
Well, in my humble submission, and thanks for asking that central question, the education catastrophe coming out of the pandemic is the major catastrophe of all the catastrophes of the pandemic. Most people tend to think about the health catastrophe first and foremost, COVID and non-COVID, and then second to that, the economic catastrophe. There are several others, of course. There are international catastrophes, there are institutional crises, but the central one, the one with the greatest numbers and the greatest forward consequences, is the education catastrophe, what happened to the young people, not just in Sri Lanka, but all around the world. Huge numbers of children were left uneducated patently or highly undereducated, and that will bleed into all systems of society tomorrow and for the balance of the century.
And Dr. Studin, in Sri Lanka in particular, how do you think we need to get around this, or to move forward? The wider question is, of course, that approximately 350,000 students on average join the education system every year, and at the end of that time, when it's time to perhaps get into university, there's only around 35,000 student spaces at university level, another 114,000 at sort of college level. But what do you think the government here ought to be doing? How can we address the problem?
Well, always come with the proviso that I don't jump into domestic affairs, and I give counsel very humbly and parametrically, because I'm a visitor and have been invited to give some keynotes. But let me walk back a few steps before I jump to counsel to the wonderful country of Sri Lanka. What happened during the pandemic is that the world of students and children was divided into three buckets. The first bucket was classical or physical school, which you and I enjoyed, and which was enjoyed by the majority of students in the world until the pandemic. The second bucket was that of virtual or online schooling, to which we imagined most children pivoted seamlessly once the schools closed. And the third bucket was no school at all, and zero school. And these kids who were in the third bucket often never returned to school. And they ended up in the third bucket for a host of reasons, but most importantly in Sri Lanka and in much of South Asia, because they never had access to internet or phone devices or Wi-Fi once things went virtual. And the numbers could be in the villages up to 80 or 90% of the student body, and in the cities maybe 5 or 6% of the student body, but it would grow over time as the school closures endured. And in Sri Lanka you had about 21 months of closures on and off those. That's a very, very long period. So South Asia in general ends up being the worst region of all the world for this third bucket catastrophe. You have in the low hundreds of millions of young people who were ousted from schooling permanently. When the schools reopened recently, they never returned. And so from grade 1 all the way to A levels, they could have been out of school prematurely, and then they're left to fend for themselves, underprepared in a world that in a secular sense is much more cruel post-pandemic. And in Sri Lanka, you feel this most acutely with the economic crisis, the energy crisis, the petrol crisis. How is an undereducated or patently uneducated child to do well? And the gap, therefore, between what that world post-pandemic requires and what the state of preparation is for the child is what I call a misery gap. South Asia is very large, but around the world we now have hundreds of millions, maybe 300, 400 million children who are in this third bucket because of the school closures and because of the inability of governments and societies to realize that they have to be brought back to school and prepared for a more difficult tomorrow. So that's a central challenge of Sri Lanka, as it is in many countries in the region and around the world.
What can we do with these children who ended up in the third bucket?
Well, first of all, I'm here to make sure that governments and education leaders appreciate the catastrophe, because when you close the schools, in my own country of Canada, just as in Sri Lanka, it is an abstraction what happens on the ground. And I'm here to report that as soon as you shutter the schools, the day after you have disintegration on the ground. That means the childhood collapses, the child leaves school often permanently, never to return at all ages for a host of reasons. But so once you appreciate it, 2 years ago already we should have been finding these young people and bringing them back to school with great rapidity, with great energy. I'm here to report at a very late stage that there's still an opportunity to go school by school, triangulate attendance records back to 2019, 2020, find where these children are, and if possible, bring them back to school, give them a bespoke curriculum, and give them an added 1 year or two, as some societies have done, in order to adequately prepare them for tomorrow. For the remainder of the student body in Sri Lanka that remains in the school system, but that has been compromised through virtual learning or no learning at all, but is still formally being educated within the system, you have to adduce huge energy. There's huge energy and ambition to that student body, because first of all, they've lost time, they've lost standards. Tomorrow will be more cruel, as we've discussed. And there's very limited time. You only have a limited time period in which to prepare the child, after which the window closes, the child becomes an adult, you're done. Our job as educators is done. The child hopefully will be able to fend for him or herself in the world, but it is our adult duty to prepare the child. If we haven't prepared the child, we've failed that moral duty. But strategically, and this is important for Sri Lanka, the failure is at the national level, because then you compare Sri Lanka and even Canada, which failed on education, or the UK, which failed in education during the pandemic, with countries and societies that didn't have this third bucket catastrophe and that didn't undereducate their children during the pandemic period. They will have successful adult classes, they will compete with our children as adults, and they will win. And we will wonder what happened. And they will think we're Martian for having closed the schools or for having this third bucket disaster at scale at our feet.
In a country such as ours, where we are rather challenged, economically speaking, and as you know, and as you said as well, we've had our own economic challenge here. What chances for the children in the third bucket?
You tell me. I think it will be a very difficult life. I mean, Sri Lanka has the good paradoxical fortune of knowing at the coalface this difference between good fortune and misery more than, let's say, parts of Canada which I inhabit, where these ideas are of a child being in no school at all and therefore going on to a dark future are very abstract. What do you mean no school at all? It took me 3 years to explain to fellow Canadians, what the third bucket meant, because we couldn't imagine that we had ejected children to no school through the school closures. In Sri Lanka, it's well understood, but the strategic imperative to prepare the society is that much greater. Your geography is difficult, you're in difficult economic times, and the pandemic has put you on the back foot. So the child has a difficult future. In the general system, there are at least two things that I would commend to Sri Lanka. First of all, say to the entire world that starting in Sri Lanka, you will never close the schools again, ever. And when I say ever, I give a small qualification. Of course, there will be terrible pandemics that affect children, unlike this one, There'll be a war at the gates. There'll be some natural disaster. You have to close the schools for a very short period. But in the mantra of the statute, in the mantra of the political class and the society and the education class, we never close schools. Sri Lanka never closed the schools, and that's because we go to the second point, and that is that the future is education. How can the future be anything but? How can Sri Lanka, or any country like Sri Lanka, and no less my own country, Canada, have a future if it has an uneducated population? That bleeds into the economic structure, that bleeds into the social structure, into the prisons, into the broken homes, into homelessness, into self-harm, life expectancy, literacy, numeracy, employability. Now, if Sri Lanka wishes to compete against countries in the rising continent of Asia, it can only do so through education. Conversely, if I were to say, I'm going to cast a spell on any society that I wish harm, for which I wish harm, I would say I would collapse their education system. There's no way forward. Conversely, again, any society that wanted to get ahead in the last couple of centuries said, we're going to educate our youngsters to the nines in the most advanced methods, with the best pedagogy, then the highest degree of energy, in order that they outcompete, excel their competitors. And so that can only be the central prescription, humbly again, for Sri Lanka. Education, 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 the rest is commentary.
Did you have, in Canada, did you have economic challenges as well?
We had catastrophes of a different description. We had what I call 7 systems crises. We had the health crisis, we had the economic crisis, we had the education crisis, we had national unity crisis, a foreign affairs crisis, an institutional crisis, social crisis, and several others probably. But the economic crisis primarily took the form of a collapse in businesses across the country. Once they closed the society, the businesses disintegrated, much like they did in parts of Sri Lanka. For instance, your famous restaurant sector disintegrated to a large degree and has not been able to recover meaningfully to its pre-pandemic form. Even worse in a country like Canada. We collapsed many businesses. Now we have inflation, we have international bottlenecks, we have international conflicts, and we forget that we wish to return to normal on the back of the rubble of closed businesses that disappeared. There is no productive business activity. So we start from a wealthier standpoint than Sri Lanka, but the economic crisis is very real, and it can not be remedied if you don't have an adequate human capital class coming around the bend to both create the next generation of businesses, to provide the labor, and to provide the energy to populate that economy.
So it really is a ticking time bomb if we don't do something about bucket number 3.
That's a great way of putting it, and in many societies, in Britain, in the United States, in my own Canada, you see already young people who are exploding in violence and who have very poor habits, whether they're in school or not. They've been poorly formed, poorly socialized. In some cases, I neglected to mention, they would have come to the third bucket by virtue of being locked in abusive homes during the pandemic. When you went virtually, you imagine that everyone who had internet was seamlessly on a Zoom call. But what if a gifted child who was yesterday doing well in school is locked in a home all of a sudden that is physically or sexually or verbally abusive? Or if the child has a handicap, or if the child or the parents become sick or poor and they need resources, or for the teenagers for whom virtual schooling quickly lost all meaning, they just quickly turned off the Zoom call or turned off the phone or the computer screen, they were out into the ether for prolonged periods. Then they explode in society, and the society, not having realized what it did in closing the school, says, what's going on? What's going on is that we ought to have monitored what happened to the kids over the last 2 or 3 years. They were not properly educated, they were not properly socialized, and therefore we reap what we sow.
How is it, in your experience, in your experience probably all over the world, how is it, what's the best form? Is it to leave the education system, the investment in education, to the private sector, or is it something that governments must take on themselves? And in Sri Lanka, the government here has very little money.
It does have little money, and many public systems around the world have little money, and there's often little money for education. But I return to the point that strategy, and from a strategic perspective, things are often counterintuitive. That is, with the money you don't have, you have to overinvest in the thing that seems least attractive in order to reap the benefits down the road. You invest, a poor society that invests in education, like China did, like Singapore did, like a lot of the Eastern European countries did in the early 20th century. They overinvested in an education with resources they hardly had in order to become advanced societies in a short period tomorrow. So Singapore, Sri Lanka must engineer the same. As for the public-private mix, I'm more partial, of course, to the public. It is the central responsibility of government to educate the next generation. The private sector plays a role. It might play a role in partnering. It might have a resource input. It also obviously has a role in hiring side and informing what the demand proposition is for the talent that comes out of a system. But if I'm not mistaken, Sri Lanka had one of the best education systems in Asia, if not the world, coming out of British colonial rule, and the early generations were highly educated, were the envy of a lot of post-colonial societies. And somewhere along the way, humbly, you lost your way, and now is the time to regain it. Dare I say, a low-hanging fruit for the society would be to declare, mind you, first amongst the nations, that Sri Lanka will never close its schools. That will send a thunderbolt across Sri Lankan society. Oh, something's up with education. Sri Lanka never closes schools. That means it's important. But it will also send a signal to the rest of the world that something happened in the pandemic, that Sri Lanka is first in class in realizing it, and first in class also in vowing never again to repeat it. The major learning of the post-pandemic period is that you never close the schools, ever.
And that is really the critical lesson.
That's the critical lesson, just like in every world war in the past, every major disaster, revolutions, civil wars, international conflict, there's always a learning, often in international law. There were anti-genocide conventions coming out of the Second World War. There were anti-chemical and biological weapons conventions coming out of the First World War, and many prior to that. The major learning of the post-pandemic, there are several, is that you do not close the schools. And for reasons now we understand, because as soon as you shutter the schools, disintegration happens irreparably, bleeding into other parts of society. If you ever did shut the schools, let's say there were enemies at the gates, or something really extraordinary happened, and it has to be extraordinary, then you would say, well, there are very strict conditions on which under which you close the schools. First of all, for very, very short periods, 1 or 2 days, 3 days, and they must be circumscribed in law. It cannot just be we return to school and when we're comfortable and we imagine that everything's best. Short, and you announce publicly to the entire country and the student body when you're returning. So the school is closed for 3 days, and on the fourth day, we expect 100% return to school. And that signals to the young people that there is an expectation of firm return to high standard education. In many parts of the world, including in Sri Lanka, the reopening was low energy, in some cases highly conditional, and the way we closed the schools in some parts of my own Canada was to declare the closure to be indefinite. Now, indefinite to a child's mind is really a permanent proposition. What do you mean indefinite? I mean indefinite, that means that's life. There's no return proposition. So for a teenager at 15 years old, there's nothing to which to look forward. I'm out. The schools reopen at 17. I'm a different person. I had no expectation of return, and I'm out. But I'm in the world with a 15-year-old education, and I'm in big trouble. And so the second rule is that you return on a fixed date, publicly announced, with high energy.
Dr. Studin, I know that I don't know whether you can really tell us the answer, but with a population, of students that is on average around 350,000 students every year, what is there like a rule of thumb even to say, if that's the case, then you need to have X amount of spaces at university level or at tertiary education level. Is there such a rule of thumb?
Yeah, there would have to be a certain engineering of the parcours, as we say in French, the pathway of a student through the Sri Lankan education system up to university or through a vocational school or something else. And that's in all societies. There's a way of engineering that. And of course the private sector plays a role. You need X number of engineers, you need X number of construction workers, and X number of service workers. And mind you, Y number of teachers. There's a huge teacher shortage in Sri Lanka. Now, I'll give one example that's been interesting on a commission that I chair on this problem of third bucket and general education catastrophe. It's called the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids Post-Pandemic, and Tara Demel, your former education secretary and dear colleague, is on this commission, as are a number of South Asians. One of the learnings from the country of Jamaica is that they added school years, indeed they added 2 school years to the curriculum in order to better incubate children who had lost out during the pandemic or who were in the third bucket. So that's a very intelligent, high energy approach, which I would commend to many societies. It's very difficult to engineer, but highly doable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Studin. Are there international aid packages, organizations who, despite all the economic challenges globally, who may be able to look at Sri Lanka's case sympathetically and provide funding for a government that is really has its back against the wall?
I don't know.
You don't know. Okay. And what about in Canada? How did you all sort of lobby the efforts to find the money, to invest the money in? Could you describe that scenario?
Invest which money?
Money to get the third bucket children and the problem of this missed education going again.
We've not, as a society now, across the second largest country in the world, with very complex federal system, not been able to, again as a country, muster that energy. We, through the institute I had and through a few projects I had, we do it at the scale possible. But in terms of national mobilization, we're still at a very prenatal stage. That is, we are not accepting that this might have happened on our watch, although we're reaping the consequences very painfully. Now, we stopped closing schools. One of the reasons we stopped closing schools is because I and colleagues in my institute and through my work were cold call the decision makers who were, in my view, criminally closing the schools in Canada after a period of obvious understanding that there were problems. We called them and they would, in the end, feel the consequences, not intellectually, but in their own households. Their own children were suffering through the school closures. If you can imagine, the decision maker who capriciously closes schools via Twitter feed, then goes to his or her cottage, but then realizes that his or her son is struggling socially and academically and intellectually, then decides that enough is enough. When we explained that this catastrophe was general, they stopped closing the schools. So we stopped closing schools. We know something's wrong with that. There will be some governments, and we're working with them at the provincial level, that will come out to say that they will never close schools again. This will be a huge provincially across Canada because we don't have a national education infrastructure. It's provincial. But Sri Lanka still can be the first major country to say we don't close schools. What we're missing in Canada is the ground game that I think countries like Sri Lanka, building on the experience of Argentina, Jamaica, some parts of India, some parts of the United States, the ground game that goes yard to yard, as the Jamaicans say, community to community, and say who dropped out of school, who defected at an early age, who needs to be brought back. And for everyone else, apart from general testing, how do we help you get back to where you need to be educationally, but for the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Dr. Irvin Studin, for being my guest this evening on Newsline. We much appreciate your time.
The pleasure.
And that's the way. And that's the way it was on Newsline this evening. Take care. Have a great evening as much as you can. And as always, God bless you all.